Cat, and I'm back because what once was will be again. I got my tippy cap on, and we are going to use a little bit of logic and research to determine some mysteries in the Game of Thrones. And the biggest mysteries that have been out there is who is Jon Snow's parents and who are Daenerys' parents. Because many believe that this is already set in stone, that it's Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark who are Jon Snow's parents, and that Daenerys is obviously the daughter of Aerys II and his wife Rhaella. Which may be true, at least on that part. But first we're going to continue to talk about Jon Snow. In part 1 of this section, I reminded everybody that the real struggle is between ice and fire. And I talked about how the others, those who appear to be the beings of ice, were actually made by a man, a real man, being tied to the all tree and a piece of dragon glass being shoved through his heart all the way to the all tree, because the dragon glass was just the conduit and it sucked out the aspect of the all that appears to be the winter or the ice. One of the things I didn't mention there is that if the others of ice were made through this magical means, then it seems to imply the potential that the Valyrians, or the people of fire in their blood, who can withstand high ratios of heat, and in Daenerys' case actually withstand fire, might have a magical beginning as well. In part 2, I pretty much disparaged the idea that it's Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. And I know it goes against the most popular, beloved theory of this entire book, the one that seems so obvious. And it sort of comports with Mr. Martin's idea of romance ending up tragically, although it seems almost overly romantic even for him. But most importantly for me, that it doesn't compute with the first constant in our actual story, which is this is a song of ice and fire. And the song of ice and fire, a song that's old as time, is about how ice and fire get together to create the yin-yang balance. And that in part 2 I said if Daenerys is fire and has fire in her veins, then it must be that Jon Snow has ice in his veins as well. And it does not seem to compute that Rhaegar Targaryen, who is of the fire blood, would be his father, because then his parentage or his lineage would not necessarily represent the ice, which he is going to have to in the near future, for some obvious reasons we'll talk about later. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is what do we know about the Starks in particular, and about the ice in their veins. So let's talk about some symbolism first. One of the things that you notice right off about the Starks is their sigil, the dire wolf. Now, if you caught Season 1, Episode 1 of Game of Thrones, one of the things we see is that there is a dire wolf that's been killed by a stag and left what turns out to be 6 puppies as orphans, which is really a foreshadowing of what happens to the Starks. All right? But when they found this and they were talking about it, one of the men says, "What is a dire wolf doing below the wall?" Dire wolves haven't been seen below the wall for centuries. Maybe for even longer than that. And another man says, you know, there's more in the woods. So you wonder how, if there's this big freaking wall up there, that the dire wolves are coming below the wall. You should wonder that. But so the dire wolves are a creature from above the wall. They're part of the magical creatures that should be blocked from going through the wall. by the magical incantations that are woven into the wall. And yet, these dire wolf and possibly more are coming below the wall. Second, speaking of their sigil, right below that it says winter is coming. Now, most people see that as the ominous portent of the change in the weather that might in fact bring another long winter and long night, because there is all this story in the background about this long winter and how the Starks might have been involved in ending that long winter. But if you look around at the other sigils and family house sayings, these aren't warnings about weather or some other idea. Theirs are a warning to their enemies. For instance, the Baratheons, ours is the fury. And for the Lannisters, hear me roar. In other words, I'm coming. Listen to my roar. And even the Targaryens with their fire and blood, which really talks about exactly how they conquered Westeros in particular, was with fire and blood. And maybe even the fact that they have fire in their blood. So when you get to the Starks with the winter is coming, this isn't just about the winter is coming, the winter is coming. This is a warning to their enemies as well. Winter is coming. They are winter. They are of the winter. And of course they live at Winterfell. And if you look up the word fell, fell actually has a couple of different meanings. Maybe the most common that would be represented here is the idea that fell is a plain, a barren plain or a moor, where in fact this is where Winterfell is resting on. It's a big freaking barren plain. But Winterfell could also mean this is where winter fell, and either where Winterfell, i.e. begins, or Endor, where Winterfell ends, where winter really fell. It ended right there. Or maybe it's just the end of winter from all the way to the north. And why is that? It starts through there. Fell can also mean ferocious, barbarous, and savage. So the barbarous, ferocious, savage winter. So all of these seem to be at play at this idea of Winterfell. Another thing that I've thought about is their sword ice. And of course we don't know that much about it. We know that the current sword that was called ice, that was made of Valyrian steel, was only between 400 and 500 years old. Nobody has the exact timing. A lot of people ask, well, how can that be possible if Aegon and his two sisters didn't conquer Westeros until 300 years previously? Then how did these people get Valyrian swords? Well, just because Aegon and his sisters didn't come over and conquer Westeros until then, the Valyrians had been around for 5,000 years. And certainly the people in Westeros had been trading with people of Essos for longer before that. We even get that idea from the Lannisters. So yeah, they could have several hundred years, even previous to Aegon and his sisters coming over to conquer, have purchased this Valyrian steel sword. But it's not the original ice. And you get the idea based on the names of swords that ice had some particular characteristics that we just don't know about. But when we think about the sword Dawn is a white milky glass that's sharp and hard, and this is why it gets its name Dawn. It has a white milky glass appearance. And there are a few other swords like Dark Sister that they said was as like dark and smoky compared to her others that seemed to drink the light. So you get it. So when you look at it like that, then ice probably has a particular makeup. And there are some theories out there that suggest that ice might in fact have been a weapon of the North, of the others. Now, there is some Arthurian legend all over our story, And I thought about that as I was thinking about this concept of ice, this ancient sword of the family, and the blood that they might have running through their veins. And the idea that there is in fact this pond that seems to be always icy cold, that Ned sits next to as he cleans his original sword next to a weirwood tree. And it reminds me of the idea that the sword in the lake or the pond from the Lady of the Lake, where the extra special sword is. Because I said there in another video, there's probably more than one extra special sword. Because, you know, the sword is just one aspect of actually what is going to happen. So we get that, and then I said in part 2 about Ned sleeping in the nude, and that while Jon's in the north, he tells Ygritte that he's from the north, and she's like, yeah, sure, right, no, you're from below this wall. And he says, no, my dad says I'm of the north. And then she said, well, who's your dad? And he says, Ned Stark. And at that point, she recognizes something about him, that in fact there is a connection between the wildlings, at least, and the Starks. We're going to talk about that in the next section, about what their blood relationships might actually be. But one other aspect of the symbolism that we need to look at is that the Starks weren't just styled kings in the north before Aegon the Conqueror, or even Robb Stark taking that title back, but they were in fact referred to as the Kings of Winter. Not the kings in winter, but the Kings of Winter. In other words, the rulers of winter. And we'll also, in possibly another section, so these don't get too long, we will talk about the mythology that goes along with why a wolf is at the gates of winter, or the lands of always winter. Thank you very much. Hit the like button. You can leave a comment, even if you don't like it or don't agree. I'll talk to you later.